Hi, my name is Alyssa Villaire. I am a young adult fantasy author, and this is the Writing Commercial YA Fiction Virtual Workshop. I'm so grateful to the Writers Workout for having me, and especially to Teresa Green and S.E. Reed. Shelby is the one who invited me, so I'm really excited to be giving this presentation today, and I hope it's helpful. So, just a little bit about me. I am the #1 Sunday Times bestselling author of The Glittering Edge and the upcoming sequel, The Neon Sky, which is coming out in May. I write primarily young adult fantasy books. My current series is a contemporary fantasy series, which is very much inspired by Practical Magic, Charmed, The Raven Boys, and other sort of witchy supernatural contemporary stories. So, before we get into kind of how we start writing our YA novel, I wanted to just first zoom out and look at what defines young adult fiction because I think for a very long time I assumed like people knew that young adult fiction was for a certain age group, and it could cover any genre. Like young adult is not a genre in and of itself; it is an age category in publishing. But what I have found over the last few years is that not everybody has the same understanding of young adult fiction. So, starting here, young adult fiction is fiction written for teens between the ages of 14 and 18. I've seen some people ask if YA goes up in terms of like the protagonist's age, like if the protagonist can be in their 20s. Generally, the answer to that is no. That would be considered either new adult or adult. And in terms of word count for young adult novels, I mean, for those of you who don't know, in publishing, we go by word count instead of by page count. And that's because once your book is being produced, the design process includes choosing a font, for example. So the actual page count of your book can change during that design process. What doesn't change is the word count. So in young adult fiction, contemporary and romance novels are generally between 60 and 80,000 words. And then when you get into genre fiction, so this could be fantasy, sci-fi, dystopian, etc., you can get anywhere from 70,000 to 100,000 words. I've seen books that are even longer than 100,000 words, but I wouldn't recommend it, especially if it's for your first novel and if you're planning to try to traditionally publish, so query literary agents and things like that. And in terms of who is reading young adult fiction, approximately 75% of young adult readers are under the age of 28. So it is a young audience, but what I would also just point out here is that 25% of readers of YA are over 28. So when you hear people talk about books that have quote unquote crossover appeal, that means that while the book was published for a certain age category, whether it was young adult or adult, it has broader appeal to readers in different age categories. So if there's a YA fiction book with crossover appeal, a lot of the readers are probably also adults. So when you're writing young adult fiction, you're not just writing for young adults, although they should be your primary audience. You could potentially be writing for adults as well. And in terms of popular genres, in specifically in commercial YA fiction, it's very similar to adult fiction. So you have thrillers, you have fantasy novels, romantasy novels, contemporary romance. There are literary books in YA that do really well. So really, again, young adult is not a genre, it is an age category, and you can write in many different genres for that age category. In terms of the themes in YA novels, the most common are stories that are about a coming of age. These characters, the protagonist, and potentially their friends, are gaining independence. And also, what I refer to as the birth of nostalgia is very common in young adult fiction. When we become teenagers, that's the first time we're really able to kind of look back on the years that we've lived with nostalgia. And you see that a lot in young adult fiction, like characters looking back on their childhoods, and on what's changed and kind of grappling with their newfound adulthood and the fact that their lives won't ever be the same as they were when they were children. And then to go even further, because I definitely have heard a lot of questions about middle grade versus YA and YA versus new adult, what the differences are. So, middle grade versus young adult. I love this quote from Laura Ruby, who is a fantastic author. She wrote Bone Gap and highly recommend it if you haven't read it. But she says middle grade is about ability, young adult is about identity. And I think that that's a great way of looking at it. Often, middle grade books will focus on adventures, and young adult books, you see the protagonist figuring out exactly who they are. That's less of a question in middle grade books. And of course, also there's the age. Middle grade books are generally for readers ages like 10 or 11 to 13. But often what you'll see is for readers who are 12 or 13, they'll start reading young adult books. Readers often like reading books about characters who are a little older than them. So that's really common too. And one other thing I'd want to note is something that Cheryl B. Klein, who is an amazing editor, and she also wrote a really fantastic book that I'll talk about in a little bit. But Cheryl B. Klein says that middle grade books are generally about characters who are they've been taken from their homes somehow, whether literally or figuratively. Like they've lost their sense of home and they're trying to get back home, back to their families, back to the routine, or back to the lives that they know. Whereas young adult fiction is about characters sort of leaving home, and finding their own place in the world. So a little similar to the Laura Ruby quote, but also a little different. So I wanted to bring that up as well, and I hope that's a helpful distinction. And then young adult versus new adult. So this is an interesting kind of comparison because there, for a very long time, new adult didn't quite exist as a category. So books that would now be considered new adult were historically published as young adult fiction. But new adult characters are generally a little older than the characters you'll find in YA fiction. So I say here they're usually between the ages of 18 to 25. Whereas young adult books focus on coming of age, new adult really focuses more on early adulthood and can also include more mature content. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you're writing a book and your protagonist is 18, but the content is a little bit more mature, you might skew new adult. Whereas if your protagonist is 18, but the story is like very focused on high school, for example, as opposed to college, then that book would probably be more young adult. And I just want to note that from here on out, everything I'm going to be sharing, these are not hard and fast rules. This is just guidance. So if you don't quite jive with something, if you're like, oh, this doesn't really feel right for my process, or this doesn't resonate with me, feel free to leave that advice behind. So when I talk about commercial fiction, what do I mean? Commercial fiction, these are plot-driven books that are meant to have broad reader appeal within the market. So that's very vague, and I mean for it to be vague because essentially any book that is widely distributed, could appeal to a lot of different readers, would be considered like commercial fiction. If you're wanting to write a piece of commercial fiction, in my mind, there are three steps to start with here. And so the first is creating your hook, the second is studying your craft, and the third is channeling your voice. And I'm going to go over each of these. So let's start with the hook. Before we even get into this, what am I talking about? What is the hook? And so when I sit down to write a new project or to outline a new project, I actually start by creating a 1 to 2 sentence hook. This is a pitch for the book that teases the major overarching plot of your novel, also known as the A plot, if you're familiar with that. So I would recommend starting with the hook before you write the manuscript, or potentially before you write the outline, which is what I do, but that's really up to you. This is just a good way to stay focused on that A plot as you're thinking about the story as a whole. And also the hook is something you can use to communicate potentially with literary agents, publishers or editors, and readers on social media, because young adult fiction readers are very much on social media. And so if you're going to be publishing commercial YA fiction and you want to create a social media presence, then having your hook is going to make it a lot easier to talk about your book as you move forward. But also just during the writing process, I find having the hook and coming back to it keeps me really focused on the main engine of the plot. Because for me, especially when I get to the second act of a book, I can really start to wander in terms of the plot, and the characters can go all over the place. It becomes really unfocused, and I get bored. And if you're writing something and you're getting bored, that means your readers are going to be bored too. So having this hook written really helps me focus during the writing process. It's also a good place to include comp titles. These are comparative titles, or books or movies that might be somewhat similar to what you're working on. Or another way of putting it is, with comp titles, if they're a fan of this movie, then I think they will be a fan of this book that I'm writing. So this is a place where you can work those in as well, and that's really helpful, especially for literary agents and publishers, to kind of picture where your book might fit into the marketplace. Um, and I say the hook should ask a question. Now, I do not mean your hook should be a question. It should not have a question mark at the end, but it creates intrigue. It kind of teases the world that you're building and the characters that you're building in such a way that people think, "Oh, how is that going to work?" And then they want to read more. The point of the hook should be to get people to want to read more. And it does not need to reveal the whole plot. Again, this is 1 to 2 sentences, so keep it as simple as possible. And I have a couple of examples for us to look at. So the first example is for my own debut novel, which came out last year. It's called The Glittering Edge. So this is the hook that I use for this book. So a girl in small town Indiana must team up with two handsome rivals to break a generational curse and save her mother's life. Perfect for fans of the Raven Boys and practical magic. So this gives you an idea of the plot, the main engine of the plot. The three main characters spend the whole book trying to break this curse. And I think the book is good for fans of The Raven Boys by Maggie Stiefvater, or the movie or the book Practical Magic. So that's the first example. The second example here is for a very, very beloved young adult contemporary romance, To All the Boys I've Loved Before by Jenny Han, which was also adapted into a fantastic movie that's on Netflix. Highly recommend it. So the hook or the pitch for this book is: when her secret love letters somehow get mailed to each of her 5 crushes, Lara Jean finds her quiet high school existence turned upside down. So, for those of you who have read the book or seen the movie, you know that like this doesn't tell you a lot about what happens, because a lot happens in this book. Lara Jean, poor Lara Jean, she goes through it. But it just is enough to tease you, to get you to want to know more. And that is the goal of the hook. Now, when you're writing commercial YA books, it is also super, super important to study the craft. And I don't just mean like literally study, although that is part of it. I mean reading widely in the genre you want to write in. So if you want to write YA fantasy, make sure you're reading other YA fantasy books that have come out in the last like 2, 3 years. So very recent. There's nothing wrong with reading like classics or books that are older than that, but reading more recent books will give you a better sense of the market and where the market is at. And if your goal is to write a book that reaches more readers, you're going to want to know what readers are gravitating towards in real time. So, just reading widely in your genre of choice, but also reading widely outside of that. So, not just reading YA books, or not just reading YA fantasy, reading YA thrillers, reading YA horror. There are so many good YA horror books out right now. And then also reading books for different age groups. So that could be middle grade, that could be adult. You can learn technique from all kinds of books. So just making sure that you're reading widely is really important, but it's most important to be reading in the genre in which you want to write. And this does, of course, studying the craft also includes reading craft books. So I have a few recommendations on the next slide. But part of learning to write is thinking about writing like from an editorial perspective, because a huge part of the writing process is not just drafting, it's revising. And so there are some great books out there that I will recommend, especially for people who are wanting to write for a younger audience. And then the third thing is just to spend time at your desk writing. Like that's a huge part of studying. It's not just studying, it's doing the writing, because when we start out as writers, we're never exactly where we want to be. Ira Glass has this great quote, and I'm not going to quote it exactly, but he basically says, because we have taste, when we start out on a new artistic endeavor, our skill level is never going to match the level of our taste. And so we have to work to bridge that gap in order to get better. And it does take time, unavoidably, it takes time. So just making sure you're setting aside that time, returning to your work in progress, and just practicing is going to be super important here. And so, a few of the recommended craft books that I wanted to share today. The first is one I've actually already mentioned. This author, Cheryl B. Klein. She is a really well known editor in the middle grade and young adult space. She wrote this fantastic book that was actually recommended to me by my agent. It's called The Magic Words: Writing Great Books for Children and Young Adults. To this day, this is the book that I return to the most when I am just looking for craft advice, or when I'm having a hard time kind of wrapping my brain around exactly what is going wrong in my current WIP. I will go back to this book. It has fantastic craft advice. It is geared towards writers of children's and young adult fiction. But honestly, anybody could learn a lot from this book. It's just so well done. So that's my number one recommendation. The second is by one of my all-time favorite authors. It's called Writing Magic: Creating Stories That Fly, and it is by Gail Carson Levine. You may know her as the author of Ella Enchanted, which is just an incredible book. Can't recommend it enough. And so this is also a story that focuses on craft at a higher level. She doesn't get into the details the way that Cheryl B. Klein does, but she has a lot of wisdom to impart. So this is a great one to read as well. And then the last one, a classic, is Save the Cat: The Last Book on Screenwriting You'll Ever Need by Blake Snyder. So this is a screenwriting book. This is not a screenwriting workshop. This is a young adult fiction workshop. But this book is renowned amongst writers of all kinds for the structure that Blake Snyder proposed as sort of the general structure of a lot of films at the time. But it's also really, really helpful when you're writing novels. There is actually a separate book by another author, actually. I'm not sure what her name is, but there's a separate book called Save the Cat Writes a Novel. I've actually never read that one. I just refer to the original Save the Cat because I think it really outlines the process super well. And that's not to say that Save the Cat Writes a Novel isn't also worth reading. I've just never read it, so I can't recommend it. The third most important point that I consider when I'm thinking about writing commercial fiction is channeling your voice. So, what is a voice? Like, people talk about this all the time in the publishing industry. It's like almost a little bit woo woo because it's like really hard to pin down exactly what makes a voice so gripping. I like Cheryl B. Klein's definition here, which is from her book The Magic Words. So she says, voice is not just a novel's point of view, but its emotional atmosphere, its narrator's thought patterns and vocabulary, how it tells a joke or opens and rounds off a scene. I think of it as the aliveness of the character. If you're reading a book and you're like, this person feels completely real to me, that to me says that the voice in that book is really strong. And sometimes when you're working on a project, a character's voice just arrives immediately. I have a character in my book, The Glittering Edge. His name is Alonzo. He's one of the three protagonists. And his voice, I didn't have to develop it at all. He arrived fully formed, and his voice was very sharp, very particular, and he stands out from the other characters on the page, I think, and readers have told me as much as well. So he really came to me immediately. But other times when you're working on a project, it can take a while for you to really nail down the voice of the book and your voice as a writer, and that's okay. This is something that really comes with practice. And also, if you're having trouble nailing down the voice, it could be that you need to further develop your character. So, my one of my other protagonists in The Glittering Edge, her name is Penny. Her voice was a little bit harder to pin down, and I think it really took me kind of backing up and outlining her history, like delving into kind of her family dynamics and some of the trauma that she had and the way her clinical anxiety affected her. I really had to spend a lot of time delving into that before her voice became clearer on the page. And then the last thing I will say is that when you're writing for young adult readers, don't condescend to them in the story and in the writing. Teenagers have less life experience than adults, technically, because they haven't been alive as long, but they are intelligent and very capable. And sometimes I think people read young adult fiction and they think, oh, this narrator sounds like an adult. But I vividly remember reading YA fiction when I was in high school and thinking that the inner monologue of these characters sounded a lot like mine. So readers are connecting with these characters, and so definitely don't go into it thinking that you can't make a story as complex or you can't make a character as complex because you're writing for young adult readers. Like, they will smell that a mile away, first of all, but also they are more than capable. So give it your all. That about wraps up my presentation. But I did want to include some references here. These are some of the articles that I read while I was preparing for this presentation that I thought were really helpful. So I wanted to share those here. And finally, just to wrap up, here is where you can find me online. So my website is alyssavillaire.com. My Instagram is at Alyssa Villaire, and my TikTok is at Alyssa Villaire author. Feel free to follow me, DM me if you have any questions. And as I've mentioned, my book, The Glittering Edge, is out now. The paperback is coming out in the US in April. And then the sequel, The Neon Sky, is coming out May 19th in the US and May 21st in the UK. So if it sounds like it would be up your alley, would love for you to check it out. But thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope that this was helpful, and enjoy the rest of the conference.